First of all, I'd like to thank Victor for inviting me back and reminding me that this is the 10th anniversary of its founding of the Asia Global Institute in its earlier form, the Fung Global Institute. I want to say thank you, particularly because in 5 minutes talking to Victor and William, I learned more about business than I ever learned, 50 years since I, left Arthur Andersen. And I learned more economics from my mentor, Michael Spence, and, the Nobel laureate I admire most, whose insights by putting the whole thing together is so superb. It's a real pleasure. And I also want to thank all the friends who have supported both the Fung Global Institute and the Asia Global Institute, particularly HSBC, which is my bank. They gave, big support, to this idea of not just global views, but local insights. And Asia is very critical in that area. So for some of you who don't know, Asia Global Institute, Barbara Meynert, who's on my panel, is my muse. She's great insights into Asia, and she'll contribute a lot to this discussion. Then Jonathan Drew, Managing Director of HSBC in Sustainable Finance, will give that perspective from the corporate and the business insights. But he has got some fabulous. And then, of course, my friend Sally Chen from the IMF, and now the advisor in the BIS, which is the biggest, well, we don't like to say it, but it's really the central bank of central banks. So, the whole idea is that I give a 20-minute, overview, but what I would like to do is actually to give I'm just using my technology to get my timer right. I want to give more time to the panel and all of you. But let me very quickly try to give you the big picture. I think Mike and the earlier panel had already given you the introduction. We live in an age of profound transformation. Even as we have this AGD, Europe is at war. COP27 is being held. Financial markets are reeling from high interest rates and market uncertainty. You had very good insights just now, right? But the news from COP27 is no good. It's not good. Let's be blunt, right? The scientists are saying, in fact, we cannot even avoid 1.5 degrees. But at 1.2 already, and if the water levels rise 3 meters, some Pacific islands and even the Maldives would probably be underwater. Physically, not even literally, metaphorically. And the funders are saying that, only 16% of some $3.8 trillion in annual investments to get to net zero, in the next 3 years, by the way, is only 16% of that needed money is there, right? And yet central banks can print trillions, So how the hell, do we get out of this? The sober scientists that I'm listening to say that we have only 8 years to 2030 to limit global warming. But what we really lack at this point of time is consensus on a sustainable trajectory, how to achieve that goal. Okay, so people are pessimistic. Now, what's Andrew Sheng saying to you guys? Greta Thunberg has 2 billion followers, and she's been saying net zero 2050 is just blah, blah, blah. But she has no plan how to get there. And so, the UN Secretary General says that we are losing the fight for our lives, being on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. Well, some of us are going there on Tesla. pretty comfortable. So anyway, we really need to stock take where we are on climate action. So let me give you the good news, the bad news before the good news. I think first, what COP27 is saying, and that's the big debate right now, China, United States, EU, and India account for more than half of historical emissions of climate warming gases. The US and Europe are the largest emitters, and China and India will be because of the large population, will be the largest emitters going forward. But it's the poorer countries that are suffering from all this. So let me share with you, an African story. When the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. By the way, the Asian version is that when the elephants make love, the grass also gets trampled. And what they forget is, but when the grass dies, the elephants die. So the issue now is, it's not just about what the elephants are talking about, it's actually what should the grass be doing in this particular time, right? And the solution to this, obviously, is technology and knowledge. And I think, Mike and others are saying, we live in a knowledge-based economy. Without that knowledge, we can't get there. The trouble is, we're sharing not knowledge, but ignorance. Because, 1972, we had the limits to growth report, and then everybody else spent the time after denying it. So it was not just the talk or the walk, society balked. It just was unthinkable, right? The climate is limited. I mean, the planet is limited. But that's reality. We live in a physical world that is limited, but a mental world of human imagination that is unlimited. And that's the real world versus the financial world. What's the difference between the financial world and the real world? In 1980, finance was 100% of GDP. Today, finance, you just add in all the financial assets, is something like about 470% of GDP. It's nearly 5 times. What's the difference between the planet that can naturally go? You look at a forest, you look at a farm, the return is 3% max, on an average basis. But if you're an investor, you're asking for minimum 15 to 25% return. So the difference between the physical and the mental is that the mental, the finance, demands an ROE, which the physical cannot deliver. And the difference between that is debt. And that's where we're printing our money out of our problems. But debt is not a problem. Debt is a serious problem because where is the asset? If we just spent it rather than invest in our future, invest in regenerating the planet, we have a sustainable future. But if we just spent it and now we fight it, right, fight each other, we're going to destroy the planet. And that's the big structural issue that we really face, right? Now, let's think a little bit about this. Because we are fighting 1 year, in fact, less than 1 year, in Ukraine, the amount of spending on the war, just for Ukraine alone, the funding that's given is nearly $80 billion. The destruction is $1 trillion, right? Just to replace Ukraine back to the war. By the way, $100 billion is the amount committed by the rich countries in 2015 to help them deliver climate net zero. And that still hasn't been committed, right? So the real issue is that the emerging markets now, particularly Africa, is angry that the loss and damage caused by their colonial legacy, nobody's helping them to make that transition to net zero, and people saying, you need to do this. So the fourth point is, the United Nations has said, well, we need to get out of this through sustainable development goals to 2030. High-level principles, but where are the programs on the grassroots level? right? And the answer is everybody is struggling. So the corporate sector said, no, we need ESG, environmental, social, governance. But the translation of these programs is huge. And if you're a startup, you know 3 things matter in getting a business to success, right? The talent, the funding, and the branding. In environmental terms, the talent is all about people, it's about knowledge, right? The social, right, is really about the equity and the justice. The branding is about trust. It's a 3-leg stool. You're short of one, you can't get there. And now, the reason why we're in this big trouble is that the bottom half of society is basically saying, we need to share that wealth, we need to share that knowledge, but we can't get it. Okay, so you can't deliver climate without inclusivity. And so it's not about E, because E is something a small guy couldn't make change. You can't fix as a small guy on the inclusivity. It really is about governance. Governance is all about people. So the United Nations Secretary General is right. Human beings should be in the driving seat. But we're not, because those in the driving seats are fighting each other, right? So to a large extent, it looks very kind of pessimistic. Change is coming from all quarters, as the previous panel told you. But is it too little, too late? So we can't just focus on one metric, right, the net zero carbon, because it's all about biodiversity loss, pollution, and social injustices. So the purpose of this panel today is not to criticize or complain. What is the real path that Asia can contribute as the new practical plans to green growth? Now, we can talk about, what do you mean by green growth? And Ma Jun, who is the real expert there, the real great thinker, he's going to talk in the afternoon session, we will be able to explain, right? It's not about talking, it's about the whole reforestation exercise, the restoration of the soil. The practical issues is not about the theory now. The science have already decided the theory. The facts are irrefutable. You may deny it, but climate change, we need action. But climate change is complex system action. So it's not one thing that will solve it. There is no silver bullet in dealing with climate change. Okay, so what those of us who study complex system change would understand, you really need to come from it through diversity, through openness, through emergence, right? You experiment with different types, and Asia being the largest population, covering the largest geographical space, with the largest, natural resources, etc., needs to get its act together. Now, Asia itself is very diverse. There is no one Asia. There are many Asias. So at this particular point, we need to think through, right? So let me just focus on what practically we can do about this. During the pandemic, I actually, worked with a group of people, and we decided there's plenty of knowledge all around. There's plenty of funding around. What we need are the practical plans to get there. So in that idea, if you really think about the world as, divided into the binary of the state versus market, these are two top-down, right? What we now need to build is the bottom-up. And technology has now enabled us to build this bottom-up. What is Wikipedia? Wikipedia is people volunteering to create social enterprise, to share knowledge. So now you have the bottom half of society, the millions of NGOs, the millions of social enterprises, millions of small, medium enterprises needing the knowledge, the talent, and the funding and the branding, and that's available with the rich countries, with the best universities, with the experts, but we can't match them. So in my view, and I've seen this, the concepts of smart villages, of what I call wiki-ori, the wiki being is voluntary, like Wikipedia, ori is the Japanese for weaving. We weave together the knowledge, the funding, the branding, so that we can actually deliver these to the people on the coalface of climate action to get them working. So I just want to say this. I have seen some amazing experiments being done in the West. I'm working with people in Iowa, Arizona, working on farms there, how they use regenerative compost to remove the chemical pesticides and the fertilizers and going to diversified cropping. These ideas can then be brought to those in India, in Amazon, in Borneo, where I come from, and really make change. Now, once they get to share that knowledge, how do you use Japanese water mills to help a Nepalese village get energy? Then they're getting that energy, immediately they can immediately get online courses, MOOC from MIT, on how to use the latest technology to bring them through maybe TikTok income at the grassroots level, right? So all this is available, and I think this is the time for us now to be very practical. Let's not talk, let's walk, let's experiment, and this panel will do that. So let me just stop here and invite Barbara, Jonathan, and Sally to come up, and we can hopefully have this nice conversation and how we're going to fix the world. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Sheng. Please have a seat. See Miss Barbara Meynert, Jonathan Drew, and Sally Chen. And Mr. Sheng is the moderator for this session.
Okay, Barbara, why did you start?
Oh, Andrew asked me to start. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. There are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen, and we have just been through some of those weeks. Okay. By the way, that's a quote from Lenin in the context of the 1917 revolution, when things happen very quickly. And I'm referring to what Mike Spence called about the regime change, and what Andrew said earlier about, deep transformations. But when that happens, when there is a regime change, when there are profound transformations, we are not in a continuum anymore. We are in a new era. And if I have something that I want to convey today, is that we need, in the new era, the old rules, the old institutions may not apply. We have to re-examine each of them. So, excuse me, at the COP meeting 2 days ago, the World Bank was badly criticized because of the way they operate as a development bank. There was funding substantially the investment in fossil fuel development. So the role of the World Bank and all the other institutions that we know will have to be re-examined and to change. And in fact, I was saying that almost all the institutions that we have had for the past 75 years will need to be re-examined. We look today at the theme of this conference, which is about recovery, reformation. And you notice how often the word re is used, reimagine, reconstitute, re-everything. And so what I really want to put forward that we need to re-examine the first principles and everything that we had belief in. Now, I am by training and by inclination a political economist. And all my life, I have worked as a banker and as a corporate executive. And at this stage, with the new era, I decided to get involved in a social enterprise. I'm basically taking up the challenge that Andrew posed. What can one do at the grassroots level? You know, I can talk for hours about, you know, how we can change and what happened to the SMEs and financial conclusion. I've been talking about that for 20 years. So, but doing something about it is quite different. So I have set up a social enterprise to help to unlock opportunities for SMEs in this time of change, in this season of where everything is being and in particular is how us SMEs could get greater global connectivity. The basic premise is that global connectivity is good for the world, for prosperity, and for the well-being of our planet. And therefore, if I can do anything together with my collaborators to ensure greater connectivity for SMEs, I'm doing my bit for the world. So I have set up a social enterprise, which is called the World Business Chamber. And I do it in the context of the chamber universe because I can identify who they are. And because the chambers are where the SMEs congregate the most, because most of their members are SMEs. So that's what I'm doing. You can go to my website. I mean, this is not to promote it, but just for those of you who are interested, it's worldbusinesschamber.org. But what is not yet there is, again, to take up another challenge that Andrew put on the table. How do you get the knowledge and the know-how and the tools that are available everywhere into the hands of the SMEs around the world who need them most? And I can focus in particular on green transition. SMEs also need to operate in a low carbon or zero carbon economy. They don't know how to, and they can't bear the cost of it. But how do we get them, how we help them to do that? Because that would make such a difference to our move to, if we can't reach 1.5, let's make it as close as possible to 2, because anything beyond that is disastrous for mankind. And I'd just like to maybe close by emphasizing one point, that when we talk about climate crisis, we're not talking about the risk to the life of the planet. The planet will survive no matter what we do. We're talking about the risk to life on the planet. We're talking about survival of our species, about the risk to mass extinction. And it's that important. So, for all of us and every one of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. It's great, points about really building the platform to connect the knowledge and the funding for the people and the know-how for people who need it. Jonathan.
Andrew, thank you. Firstly, I did just want to say a huge thank you to Victor and his team for this session, having listened to the first session, illuminating, inspiring, and important in so many different ways. So thank you to you and the team, and particularly important in the world of finance. And I think particularly important in the world of finance is the Asian dialogue and the Asian narrative, because although it's not about talk, but the narrative is important in facilitating the actions that will drive the change, because we do operate in this global system, and as others have said, the solutions will be a functioning global system that cooperates and collaborates and avoids all of the negative things. When I look at the world of finance and sort of how it's changed and how that's sort of setting and defining the challenges, how finance will make its contributions, I sort of am reminded of my own conversations within the bank maybe 10 years or so ago when I first got engaged on this topic. And really at that point in time, nobody was talking about even the existence of planetary boundaries. And nobody was really thinking about the consequences or the impact of crossing those boundaries. And when I spoke to colleagues about the concepts of nitrogen and eutrophication and methane and band saturation, people would look at me and say, well, and I can see some of my colleagues in the audience smiling, saying, Jonathan, I studied banking and finance. What's with all the physics, chemistry, and biology here? But those conversations don't happen today. They don't need to happen today, which is the positive here in terms of the awareness that has improved. Also, that we have made good progress in setting out some of the big objectives, so the awareness of the problem and the identification of key objectives to solve some of those issues, and an obvious one being in the area of climate, that you don't really have to explain or justify or argue for net zero today, other than, as you said, Andrew, to the real deniers. Yes, there's an important conversation around how do you define net zero and what's the slope or the shape of the pathway. But we've now really have moved from sort of why to how do we deliver, how do we deal with that. And I think in the world of finance at a high level, it's really the challenges are how do we allocate capital to the things that will support the transition and move capital away from the things that are not aligned to the transition and those ultimate objectives. But then importantly, and coming back to the dialogue and narrative piece, we have to deal as a sector with the expectations that society is rightly placing on us to do the right things, and particularly to disclose and explain and meet those expectations. Of course, from those who must be obeyed, our regulators, of course, but more broadly to society as a whole. So, but the challenge then in doing that is, as others have said, we're dealing with this huge uncertainty. There is no clear definition of what green is. There's no rule book that says, put your money there and it'll all work. Put your money there and nobody will criticize you. So we have to deal with that uncertainty, focusing on, in a sense, a whole range of activities from those that we know will make a difference. Capital to the technologies that we know are going to be critical. They're tried and tested, and scale those. But then also dealing with what we're not so certain about. Other methodologies, new financial products, technologies that don't exist at scale, or even technologies that don't exist at all to decarbonize and make sustainable certain parts of our activities. So we are also involved in applying capital where we know, but we're also needing to try a lot of ideas. Imagination you talked about, Andrew. Those things we're not certain. We don't know that a sustainability-linked bond is going to provide X% of a solution, but it's a good idea, and we should deploy it, and we should work to make it as effective as it can be. We don't know that committing ourselves to the Glasgow Financial Alliance to net zero and setting emissions targets is going to be the solution. We know it's an important metric, but it's not on its own a complete solution. So we need to commit to those to show our overall commitment. We need to commit to measure progress. But when we get down into the individual actions, and it is going to be multiple thousands, millions of individual actions that will actually solve this, and I won't go through the whole list of what the bank is doing, And I certainly won't talk about the green bond markets and the green loan markets, but to illustrate some of the other areas that we are looking at, from basic financial services like opening bank accounts and making payments for clients. What's the carbon impact? How do we reduce that impact? How do we work with our clients who are providing web services to drive those changes? How do we report the impact of a payment to our clients who are using our services? Because we're very good at demanding our clients give us data, but we also have to recognize that, you know, we are in the supply chain of our clients. So we need to be able to show them the data on their impact of making a payment instruction to us. And we're also at the same time saying we need to reduce that because we want to be competitive. So our software engineers are out there working out, designing the programs to make sure that we're using the lowest carbon impact servers, or at least factoring carbon into the decision as to how those programs will drive server usage. And then for some of the big areas, and to, you know, Michael's point on energy transition, how do we bring capital into that space, innovative structures? So we were delighted that just earlier this week we were able to indicate our support to a very significant package of support for the Just Energy Transition Partnership. So we had half a dozen advanced nations who've committed a serious pool of capital to drive the early retirement of coal-fired power plants in Indonesia. And of course, the private sector banks, and we're privileged to be one of those, has a big role in coming up with the structures that will facilitate that capital to flow and meeting some of those sort of north-south flows that have been missing. And then a final example in our asset management book, how we are, you know, again, raising pools of capital to invest into everything from natural resources to climate tech, some positive yielding investments, Andrew, that get us close to those sort of levels of return that investors are looking for, as well as the development of the new technology that will actually enable, in one of our investments, soil to be more productive, absorb more carbon. So these are really, I think, where how finance has changed, how an institution like ours, but there are many others as well doing this, are trying to drive the change. And of course, in doing that, our clients are key, the market is key. We do, and I think we all in the financial services industry also need to be collaborating with other market participants to make the markets more effective, better standards, good practice guidelines to get more money to where it's needed.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for bringing this perspective in. I think we can have even more conversation on how do we define green growth. But finance, and I just want to say something about Asian diversity. On top of what large financial institutions like HSBC is doing, the Securities Exchange Board of India just finished a consultation on a social stock exchange. And the social stock exchanges enable any social enterprise, which Barbara fully supports, to access funding from listed markets. And what are they going to list? A zero coupon, no return instrument. And what is that? And that means that actually you will literally crowdfund the social enterprise that actually puts themselves up as a bulletin board to say, I need capital, I need know-how. Those of you who want to give to me, raise your hands, and they match them. So Asia is innovating in ways that are amazing. And I just want to give us, that's the good news in my view, what's happening. Now, Sally, maybe you could now explain what IMF, BIS thinks about these issues.
Well, yes, thank you. And thank you, Victor, for the opportunity. And I want to thank my fellow panelists, Barbara and Andrew, for your very impassioned charge and plea, really, to do better, to rethink, to re-examine. And Jonathan, for your really nice summary of really how the financial system is reworking itself to meet the challenge of today. I want to pick up two themes that Andrew brought up in your speech. One is this idea of inclusive growth and equitable growth. And the other is this idea of essentially a financial infrastructure. What is the new infrastructure? Under what system can we more efficiently match the supply of capital with the demand of capital? These are two things that we've been working on. These are two issues that actually are personally close to my heart. So, this audience perhaps doesn't need a reminder, but certainly one of the challenges we have for SMEs and for small businesses is really this access to capital, as Andrew said. And we had, I think World Bank recently had a survey, and out of the 70 firms that access loans and funding, 70% noted that they need collateral. And the average collateral they need to post is 235% of the loan value. That's the heart of the issue for our financial infrastructure at the moment, which really is that the fact that the banking system being rational relies on tangible collateral for loan decisions. So this means that those who don't have the opportunity to accumulate this capital, quite often the young, because they haven't had a chance to do this, the poor, who never do, and often women are left out of the formal financial system. And that leaves out a very productive segment of the population. It leaves out the opportunity to innovate on a broad scale. And that has a cost. So we've been looking into that. And Andrew mentioned this call for practical solution. One thing that's really happening in Asia, all around us, of course, is financial innovation. But what we see is, along with financial innovation comes new opportunities. One thing that we know from our personal life is that the amount of time we spend online. Guilty myself, and I look around my house, I know my family probably spend more time online than they talk to each other. But the amount of time we spend online, the activities we do online leaves digital footprints. And that digital footprints is, to some extent, very invaluable information that could be harnessed for lending decision. We call this information capital that could substitute tangible collateral. And we're seeing this in Asia. We're seeing here in Hong Kong, there are digital banks Live Bank, Mox, AZ, PAO Bank. In China, there's the WeBank. A lot of these quote-unquote new banks, virtual banks, are doing away with their physical presence. They're doing their business online. But what they're also doing is address this information asymmetry in terms of reliance on capital. And this financing gap that the demand for tangible collateral place on borrowers. And what we're seeing, for example, is this technology allows these lenders to reduce their operating costs, allow them to access a segment of the population that had traditionally been uneconomical for them to access, for them to lend to. So for example, in WeBank, something we learned is, this is as of 2020, the average loan size for their retail borrower is 8,000 renminbi. So that's roughly a little bit over 1,000 USD back in 2020 value. The average interest paid on these loans is 100 renminbi. That's unthinkable for a traditional bank. That is a business that's simply not viable. And if you leave these kind of lending to the traditional bank, that segment of the population will forever, well, maybe not forever, but for a long time, be excluded from formal access of funding. So what happened is, as we all know, the story of WeBank, a large segment of the population, SMEs and households, are now able to access formal funding. So from our perspective, this is something that's incredibly hopeful. And this is certainly one practical solution to the call that Andrew and Barbara have raised in terms of how do we move forward? How do we connect people who really need capital, who have the local know-how, and bring them forward, bring them into a future that's sustainable, inclusive, that offers positive opportunities for everyone. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Sally. Really insightful. Focus on inclusive growth. Focus on the knowledge infrastructure. Just putting it into perspective, right? How did the West rise after 1500? They built the knowledge infrastructure, the universities, right? That knowledge, and they built the markets, right? And they created the enterprises to drive, using that knowledge. And, Asia didn't understand that. And boom, in 500 years, the world was changed. Inclusive growth. What did Asia contribute? Asia took that knowledge from the West. It was exported and re-imported. And in the last 70 years, brought hundreds of millions, out of poverty, right? Out of poverty. So Asia has that contribution. Sally, you really mentioned this about no collateral. But actually, this is an intellectual issue, right? Previously, banks will not lend to you without physical collateral, physical capital. Today, the tech markets will finance you if you got intellectual capital. But what the economists forgot, that the biggest capital of all is natural capital, which we did not include in GDP. Natural capital is only begun to be counted in 2021 when the United Nations System of National Accounts started measuring natural capital. And what we actually discovered is that natural capital actually GDP discounts natural capital, right? Growing up in Borneo, buying a chainsaw, depending on fossil fuel, in 3 minutes cut down a 150-year-old tree. That tree growing there provides the biodiversity, is not counted in GDP. The chainsaw and my activity to cut down that tree is included, right? So, this goes to show how the wrong metric and the wrong, incentive has created the damage that we've now seen. So we're right into this, very important area. Let's talk about what do we mean by green growth. Barbara, you've got some very good views on that.
Well, the concept, as far as I can trace back, the concept of green growth was announced by the OECD in 2009. So many papers were written, but so far we have not seen any evidence of green growth in the totality, to the extent that there is GDP growth that has not used the resources. And in the framework that I said earlier about re-examining first principles and the things that we have accepted in the past, I would question both the definition of growth that we have been using and maybe also the definition of green. So until we have a more time appropriate to fit our new era of the definition of green and growth, it's very difficult to be more specific from my perspective.
Thank you, Barbara. Jonathan?
Difficult to add too much to what Barbara said there, but I think clearly there are the two elements. There's green, what is green, and there's growth, which is really the metrics point. I think green, there is a general alignment on a concept, that it's something that is either delivering a solution that has a lesser environmental impact than an alternative or a benchmark, so it delivers in that sense an environmental benefit. But I think also more broadly now, the expectation is that it's also an activity that generally aligns to achieving those bigger global social objectives, Paris Agreement temperature targets and so forth. So I think there are those two concepts in there. Growth, of course, and the metrics issue. I mean, I completely agree with your point, Andrew. I think this is the deeply embedded one that's going to be very, very difficult and time-consuming to change. But we should absolutely not discourage, and we should absolutely support the work of ISSB and getting better reporting, and the unmeasured to date critical factors into reporting and accounting for that. I think as an accountant myself, I think the profession has failed in really driving that forward more quickly. But that will take time. So then I think, so what do we do in the light of those restrictions? And this is where I think it's actually really critical if Asia to achieve its form of green growth. And everybody's talking about it. We heard the chief executive, 4% plus across the region. We need to put forward our view of what is green growth. And we need to explain why we think that's green growth. And we need to explain why it's consistent with the global temperature and other sustainability ambitions. And perhaps in there's a concept to say that in a business or with an activity that today involves the use of hydrocarbons, and let's look at the climate piece, in the short term, the volume increases may outweigh the efficiency increases that we're investing in, but in the long run, we have a plan such that the activity will decline to zero as the economies mature, as growth levels subside naturally, and we will drive a very accelerated efficiency improvement program. And in many cases, I think to do that, we've got to, again, to your point, Andrew, we need to look for those technologies and areas where we can leapfrog what happened in advanced economies. Advanced economies have a problem, it's because it's a lot about retrofitting. And we all know how difficult that is. But when you're building from new, you don't need to go through the sort of the heavy high carbon processes. You can go to your, take Shenzhen, for example, you can go to build a city around an electric transportation network from the ground up, and that's an opportunity. We can look at your sort of new systems for agriculture that don't involve the massive high tillage. We can move as we grow food systems to be low impact. I mean, Chinese agricultural systems were, to your comments on history, Andrew, sort of renowned for their efficiency and usage of water and so forth. So I think it's those leapfrogging technologies to drive a rapid deceleration or decrease in carbon per unit of output or carbon per unit of energy. That's what needs to be part of the Asian story, and we need to communicate it clearly, because otherwise we risk finding ourselves being excluded from parts of, and an ever-growing part of, the global capital pool.
Terrific. Sally, wearing your economist hat, also from the IMF background, talk a little bit about this growth, degrowth debate. I mean, there's a lot of this discussion, right? And I think all of you should know about the issues.
I suppose we could think about this from several perspectives. And just to follow up on what the panelists, what Barbara and Jonathan saying, I think part of this growth, degrowth debate can be encapsulated in two issues. One is, as you said, Andrew, how do we go about measuring this? Traditional GDP metrics certainly has missed out on a lot of the sectors, a lot of the activities that no doubt contribute to growth, and how do we capture that? That's something that we're grappling with. That's one, and I would say technology can help. But the second issue, I think, Jonathan pointed out is this idea of spillover that we need to think about when we think about growth. And I think if anything, COVID, certainly this pandemic, remind us that the way we had traditionally think about growth, which is really profit generation, a primary focus on, say, one singular metric of success, has failed us because there are knock-on effects. The idea that, so as an economist for a long time, even today, we talk about how Asia is the bright spot, how Asian growth is really, to some extent, the future. But what we should also realize is that there's Asia is also incredibly vulnerable to some of the decisions, at the receiving end of some of the decisions and repercussions that we had made. So for example, over the past 10 years, 5 of the 10 largest natural disasters happened here in Asia. On average, over the last 3 decades, roughly about 45% of major disasters happened in Asia. And this is a place with a sizable small economy that's incredibly vulnerable to these kind of spillover effects that are least able to withstand the knock-on effect. So when we think about growth, to me as an economist, these days, increasingly, we need to think about spillover and knock-on effect, and to what extent will that spillover and ultimately spill back affect your own profitability and the viability of your own business. Because at the end of the day, I think, Andrew, you mentioned this, there's tremendous degree of interconnection that happens across economies, across corporations, and certainly different segments of society.
Thank you. Sally, you made a fundamental point. Asia still remains a very growth zone because there are parts of Asia that are aging, but large parts of Asia that is actually still very young. They need to grow, right? You can't stop that. But at the same time, Asia is very vulnerable to climate change. And you reminded us that natural disasters, all our pollution, all our mistakes in the, overbuilding of very energy inefficient buildings, the way rules, etc. So we need to rethink this. Okay, this is Asia Global Dialogue. So now's the time for us to get the questions going. So we're open up to questions from anybody, okay? You can't beat, these guys for the depth of knowledge, this change. Change is coming. How do we change? Okay, over there. Varun, I think.
Thank you to the panel for some terrific insights on a very, very important and topical question, particularly given the week of COP27. Can I just get the panel's thoughts on transition? Due to ESG and other constraints, rightfully, there are, any project that has anything to do with fossil fuels, oil, coal, whatever, is being shunned and becomes very, very difficult to finance. And there are good, long-term, understandable reasons for that. But we've got a timing issue. Are the new technologies available and coming on, at a speed, that can make a sensible economic transition from fossil fuels to renewables, et cetera. So can we talk about how that transition can be a smooth one as opposed to there being, tremendous price increases, because there isn't enough supply on the fossil fuels, et cetera, the existing fuels before the renewables come online?
Varun, thank you very much for bringing a very important point. Transition, transition, transition. We're in a time of change. How difficult is that transition? Who pays for the legacy costs of the transition? And who pays for the future costs, right? So, okay, open up. Who wants to tackle this? Okay, Jonathan? Jonathan, and then Sally.
I'm happy to have a first go because I know my fellow panelists will sweep up where I make a mess. Look, it's a hugely important issue. I think the first point I would make is, and perhaps again is one of these areas where we have to be more clear in developing the narrative and the awareness that, of course, in any transition process throughout history, and we've seen it already in the current process as it starts to evolve, is that you need a huge amount of the old energies to actually create the new energy system. And that, I think, is at the core of why we have to be, we need to reposition supporting fossil fuel activities as part of the transition. Because not only from a materials perspective, I mean, you can't make a material number of wind farms today without coal. You can't make a material number of solar panels or install a solar farm without using, you know, one or both of oil and gas. You can't do it. And so we need to, and also, so that's the sort of the materials piece. The energy piece I've touched on, and the financial piece, of course, because in the same way that the economies today, advanced economies who have transitioned, they've used the wealth created by the activities supported by the old energy to fund and finance the development of the new energy systems. So it's the old systems that actually act to disrupt themselves and support the development of the new system on all of a materials balance, energy balance, and financing and wealth perspective. And I think that's the critical part. While we should therefore, and this is obviously something that we face all the time as a financial institution, and financial institutions and investors generally face it, sort of, why are you financing fossil fuels? Well, this is the reason. There is actually an environmental and a strong environmental rationale for doing that. The discussion, though, does, of course, get more complex, as always, at the fringes around, well, you know, should you be financing a new oil field or a new coal-fired power plant? And there's rightly a lot of debate around that, and the answer is often, in some cases, it might be justifiable, but in most cases, it's not. So there are important decisions and boundaries to be drawn there. But I think the core is understanding the role of fossil fuels in the transition. If we can get that awareness raised, I think the rest of the conversation becomes much, much easier.
Thank you, Jonathan. Sally, you wanted to add?
I guess I would just add that I really don't have much to add to Jonathan's insight, but I would say from the central bank's perspective, what central banks are trying to do is not to discriminate against, say, the traditional collateral that's based on, say, quote unquote, the older way of producing. But what central banks are doing really is to be a bit more inclusive, taking into consideration, say, green bonds as part of the open market operations for their collateral acceptance, to broaden the basket of collateral that's accepted. So in that sense, it helps to encourage these new green initiatives without really cannibalizing the existing way of producing.
Barbara?
I have nothing to add apart from to comment that the European experiment should give us some lesson on, you know, both transition and diversification. We should have a clearer picture in 12 months' time.
Yes, Casey Kwok.
Thank you, Andrew. I note that all our speakers on the panel have some background in finance, and I also come from a finance background. I want to raise a conceptual issue, which is that, you know, finance is all about, you know, as Jonathan said earlier, allocation of capital. But from financial sector's perspective, allocation of capital is closely tied with how you measure risks, how you price risks, how you get a return for taking those risks. But then the fundamental problem is that, you know, those most vulnerable to risks, you know, the kind of risk we are talking now, we're talking about now are the places where you have high political risk, where you have, all those risks are, normal market pricing is just not justified from a financial perspective. Sometimes it could be the industry, sometimes it could be those vulnerable people. How do we make the whole financial system more willing to allocate capital to those risky areas? You can't just rely every time on government funding and public policy changes. Somehow, talking about this knowledge infrastructure, we need to change some very fundamental things. Like, natural capital, when there is no price for natural capital, people don't care.
Great point. Anybody wants to try this?
Yeah,
Sally,
I guess Casey, I'm quite optimistic that we can overcome some of the old metrics that we have relied on for capital allocation. In part, again, as people here know, and certainly many of you are experts in this far more than I am, that when it comes down to lending, it's a rational business. Just like any other business, you don't want to lend to customers who are not profitable. And because of information asymmetry, traditionally, the way you monitor risk, the way you recoup loss is through a tangible possession of a tangible collateral. But I think what the virtual bank experiment, I shouldn't say experiment, actually it's been happening, and digital banking and technology in payment and in lending has demonstrated that there's a new trove of information that's immensely valuable, that allows us to really bypass really some of the older metrics that we rely on. So again, going back to the virtual bank operating cost example and the risks they bear on their balance sheet and loss they've seen on their balance sheet, the NPL ratios, for example, virtual banks, despite the fact that they are targeting, say, smaller businesses or a quote-unquote more vulnerable segment of the population, their NPL ratio, take WeBank, for example, is substantially lower than the traditional brick-and-mortar conventional bank. And when we look at the distributional impact of technology in terms of lending decision, it is incredibly powerful, and I'm so encouraged by that. You look at the virtual banks in Asia, in Japan, in Indonesia, in Korea, a large portion of the virtual bank users are young people. In Indonesia, the 24 to 35 cohort users are primarily women. And in Japan, a lot of the virtual bank users are women. The elderly are women. So these are two groups that have traditionally not met the metrics of a profitable lender, are now benefiting from these technologies. So to me, I am quite hopeful.
Anybody else?
Yeah, coming again from the framework of the new era, I actually think that we can look at new innovations like the central bank digital currency, because right now, most of the central banks are looking and experimenting with issuing their digital currencies, and many of these will be programmable money. And for the first time in human history, we will have money that can be programmed, it's programmable. And perhaps, because we haven't got it yet, that we can achieve the financial inclusion and targeting money to where it's most needed, most risky. So that's something that would be in what we all call, the new era.
Jonathan?
Andrew, I think the only point I would add, and these two brilliant descriptions of some of those specific interventions and the role of fintech, new approaches to finance are critical in. But on the fundamental question of that sort of, yes, capital allocation, it's risk and return. On the risk piece, I think what we are seeing, again, encouraged by regulators now, in the assessment of these long-dated scenarios, which are embedded in guidance under TCFD and otherwise. There's a lot of work going on addressing what those risks are that need to be assessed in there. But the piece that's missing at the moment, and I think the regulators, the Network for Greening the Financial System would acknowledge, at the moment are the social transition mechanisms. So the impact on, a borrower who is dependent upon the community that you've just described that is vulnerable of climate change when that community becomes disrupted. That's just not factored into the risk at the moment. So that is a work in progress, but you're right, it's a missing piece and something I think we really have to work on.
Thank you. I think, Casey, you raised a very fundamental point, which is the shift in thinking about risk. The finance in the modern textbooks by the finance guys miss the fundamental point of systemic thinking around 1500. I just want to share this with you. I was at Dunhuang on the edge of the Silk Road, and I looked west, 1,000 miles of desert. Okay, look east, maybe another 500. And I asked myself, could conventional banking finance the caravans? And the answer, traditional banking, no way. The caravan's going to be robbed, they're going to get lost in the desert, they're going to be cheated, they're going to be confiscated. It's capital, capital, capital. You think about it, 1500, 1493, who financed these ships to go, across the Cape of Good Hope via Africa and then went to discover America? Venture capital. Equity, equity, equity. Banking is about risk transfer, collateral. Equity is about risk sharing. So what mainstream economics, which is based on classical physics and mathematics, has forgotten is about optimization, efficiency. Biology is about adaptation, survival, and resilience. And I think Mike's point about how technology is now moving, out of just quantum into bionics, shows that even in science, particularly in ecology, the thinking is now shifting not just for pure efficiency and how you think you can manage risk. All these risk models, as you know, VAR models or et cetera, fail, right? They fail because they did not take into consideration the black swan. What you don't measure, you think don't exist, it's going to kill you. So I think, we're in a changing world. Climate change is system change, including biological systems, not just physical systems, and imaginary systems, imagination. So the point that you made is very, very good. I think, central bankers and regulators are beginning to see this, but not quite there yet. Anyway, next question. Everybody satisfied? They're hungry, actually. Okay, so any last words from the panel? Barbara?
Just to say, it's such a pleasure to be here with you all and to have such a great audience who's so interested and so involved in what we have been saying. So thank you.
Jonathan.
Well, Andrew, similarly, I think the appeal from my side is continue the collaboration and the sharing, because knowledge is critical. Nobody is a repository of all the answers, but the more we share, the more likely we are to, find answers and solutions that will make a difference.
Sally?
I would just say that there's now growing literature on the fourth industrial revolution, which is really boosted by knowledge and productivity. So the fact that we're here, the fact that we're sharing our knowledge is invaluable, and I'm hopeful. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the panel. Let me just, thank you.
Thank you all.
I just have one last word.
Please go ahead.
I hope you don't mind me saying the last word.
Yes, please.
I really want to sum up by thanking the panel and Khadija, but I really want to say being back here, in Hong Kong after 3 years after the lockdown, taught me several things. Number one, we have been in social bubbles, and all the strategic mistakes of the last 3 years was because we cut the physical feedbacks. Okay, knowledge is about feedbacks. If we get the feedback like what we're doing here, it's not what we're learning here, it's when we chat over coffee and sharing and eating together. That's what makes it. Second point, I think, is what makes Hong Kong. Hong Kong is exactly that. Hong Kong is all about food, all about eating, all about talking, all about connecting. The Asia Global Institute and the dialogue, which I think Victor and William and the bank and all of you have made, is the energizing and the empowerment which Hong Kong represents. Whenever I come to Hong Kong, I am energized, I feel connected, I feel empowered, and that's Hong Kong, because it was a bare rock. And today, it's all about people, it's about connecting, it's about convening, and I think I want to thank Victor and William, and the whole fantastic team of the Asia Global Institute and Hei Wai and Yvonne and Al and all the others who have made this very great event and bring back the energy to Hong Kong. Thank you very much indeed.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. Thank you.